Good afternoon and welcome to the Royal African Society. People are still joining us, but let's not delay because we want to get as much time for discussion in as we can. Welcome also to the launch of Michela Wrong's new book, Do Not Disturb. The Royal African Society exists to enable African voices to be heard in conversations here in the UK and across the world, including in Africa. And we aim to connect people, to educate people and help them learn about Africa, to celebrate African achievements and to debate African issues. And that means enabling voices to be heard, including voices that some may prefer not to hear. But they are an important part of the conversation about Africa. And what we are trying to do at the Royal African Society is enable us to discuss and debate these ideas. They're not always ideas that we may agree with, but it's very important that the debate can take place. We have recently had meetings, including about Ethiopia, where very divergent views were expressed on the same panel. It's available, recorded. You can watch it on our website if you like. So this is very much part of what we are trying to do. And that includes getting a very real impression of Africa as it is here in the UK. And we are supporting a parliamentary inquiry at the moment, just setting off, to discuss Africa in the British school curriculum, because it's very important that school children here, people all over the UK, should have an accurate view of Africa. We hold in the near future, in May as well, a meeting that will discuss the economic transformation of Africa. And details of that will be on our website very soon. In that context, Rwanda, like Ethiopia, is very often considered a model of how African transformation should take place. That is one of the issues under discussion here today. So I'm very pleased to welcome everybody. I have to say, Michela, your title of your book is perhaps inappropriate because it seems to have disturbed quite a lot of people, but that's what we are here to discuss. And I'm very pleased now to hand over the chair to Chris Cramer, Professor Chris Cramer, who is a member of the Royal African Society's Council, but more important, Professor of Political Economy at the School of Oriental African Studies in London, University of London. And he is the author of more books than I could possibly list about Africa, but I think more important, you have undertaken research across a whole range of African countries. And that's that practical hands-on experience that I think we very much welcome today. Chris, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nick, and thanks to everybody for joining in and welcome to what I hope is going to be a very lively discussion. We're here to launch this book, Do Not Disturb. It's out now, published by Fourth Estate. That's a HarperCollins imprint. So it's available on various alternative online book buying platforms, but also luckily now in the UK we're, I think, allowed to go to bookshops, so you can get it in your Waterstones or Daunt or wherever. It is a very, very remarkable book. It's extremely readable and well written, I do want to say. It's all sorts of things at the same time. It's a sort of whodunit. It's a history, but a regional history told particularly through very, very personal individual stories. It's an inquiry, I think, into the nature of Western attachments. It's a probing of how regimes change over time. And it picks at the threads of a very, very intriguing debate about politics and socioeconomic development, without necessarily resolving that. And of course, any book trying to do all of those things is going to be divisive, and it will be, but I think it's an extraordinary contribution to our knowledge and to debates. And so I want to welcome and thank Michela Wrong, the author, for joining us to do this. Michela is a very distinguished international journalist with a career of reporting coverage for the BBC, for Reuters, for the Financial Times. She's also a very distinguished author. She's a prize-winning author of In the Footsteps of Mr. Kurtz. She's the author of other books, non-fiction books, including We Didn't Do It For You on Eritrea, It's Our Turn to Eat, a Kenya book, and so on. But what many people often forget is she's also a novelist. She wrote a novel called Borderlines, which is also Eritrea focused. So what Michela is going to do is, in a very short time, about 12 minutes, introduce some of the themes and the background to this book. And then we're very lucky to be joined by 3 panelists who I will be ruthless in controlling the time of. They've got very short time to provide their reactions to the book before we then open this up to a Q&A. Now, just to say something very briefly about that, we will not be unmuting people to put their questions. This is just the way we run quite a lot of our events through the Royal African Society. So please, if you have a question to raise, could you raise it by typing it, not in the chat box, so I see somebody already has, but in the Q&A box. And then my job will be to try and pick some of those from what may well be a large number of questions and give a floor to various different perspectives. So try and keep your questions concise so I don't stumble over reading out long essays and so on. So I think that's probably clear enough for me to introduce, and I'm just going to pass straight on to Michela to introduce the book and get us going. Thank you, Michela.
Thank you very much, Chris. And I'd really like to thank the Royal African Society for giving me my first chance to talk about my book in public. It's a very precious opportunity, and I'm very grateful. So Do Not Disturb, which was the result, it's my longest book, and I suppose it took longer to write as well than most of my other books, nearly 5 years. 4 years, 5 years. So it kicks off, because this is the event that triggered it, with the murder in South Africa in the Michelangelo Hotel of Patrick Karegeya, who was the former head of external intelligence for Rwanda, someone who had once been at the supreme summit of the Rwandan government system. And he was lured to a hotel room by a friend called Apollo. And there he was strangled by almost certainly a group of agents who had been sent from Kigali to carry out that job. His body was found on the 1st of January 2014. And the South Africans have issued arrest warrants for the 2 men that they believe are responsible, but not surprisingly, there's no sign of them being extradited from Rwanda so far. So this was a really shocking event, and it was shocking for anyone who had known Patrick in his prime, because he was always the man who was at Kagame's right hand, sort of whispering helpful advice in his ear. They'd known each other since they were children. They had grown up together in Uganda. They had gone to the same school. As young men, they had both joined the Bush in the NRM rebel movement that was founded by Yoweri Museveni, today's Ugandan president. And then they had joined the intelligence system under Museveni, and joined the secret cell, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, this secret army that was forming inside the Ugandan Defense Forces, and which would eventually go into Rwanda in 1990. So I thought, you know, how did we get here? You know, how did it end up that this man who was so close to the president would end up being killed by his former boss, you know, on the orders of his former boss and his former friend? As I sort of wondered if there was a story to tell there, and started to interview the people attached to, who were, the members of the family, Patrick's wife, his nephew, his children, and his colleagues in the opposition movement that he had set up in South Africa, the RNC. I began to realize that Patrick was only one of many intended victims. So one of his closest colleagues in the RNC was General Kayumba Nyamwasa, the former head of the armed forces, a very popular general in Rwanda who had also fled to South Africa and joined the RNC. And he'd already had several attempts on his life. He'd been shot in the stomach, but had survived. And there were many, many other cases, less well known, less well publicized, of exiles, former insiders who had once been very close to Kagame and had fled and then been targeted for possible assassination at the very worst. On many occasions, it was more about trying to silence these people, harass them, threaten them, follow them around, and just keep an eye on them. So it seemed to be a very extensive network of undercover operations being run out of Rwanda. And what was really surprising was to discover how many of the police forces in countries like the UK, in the States, in Canada, in Belgium, France, Australia, how many of them knew what the Rwandan government state was getting up to, and how many of them would be happy to go and warn the Rwandan exiles that they were in danger, but didn't seem to be too bothered about doing any more than that. So this was, a lot of this was a revelation to me, and I certainly didn't see it being reported in the press very much. There would be the occasional story surfacing in the media, but people weren't really joining the dots up together. And I think, given that I was somebody who had covered the post-genocide period in Rwanda, I'd first gone in there in July 1994 and been incredibly impressed by the RPF, as almost everybody was. And then, watching the way they try to reconstruct the country and their ambitious program of development and reform, discovering that there was this operation to take out possible critics and silence them was really quite sobering. And it was a bit like lifting up a sort of very polished, attractive rock and seeing all these maggots squirming around underneath them. So the question then began, how did we get here? Because, I've mentioned Nyamwasa, I mentioned Patrick Karegeya. There was also Theogene Rudasingwa, the former chef de cabinet of Paul Kagame. There was also Gerald Gahima, the former Solicitor General, many high profile officials. And this really was the point for me that I found very interesting, that so many of these men were members of a Tootsie elite, a ruling Tootsie elite, and that so much of the coverage that I'd read up until then was focusing on the threat that was posed to the Rwandan government established by Paul Kagame and his colleagues, and that possible threat coming from the former extremists who committed the genocide and who were hiding up in the forests of Congo and other places. And that tended to still be the paradigm in which we looked at events. But these men were members of the system. They were very, members of that inner sacred circle that had used to run Rwanda. So they were not Hutu extremists. They were RPF insiders, and yet they were denouncing their former colleague, Paul Kagame, as a dictator, as a man with an increasing amounts of blood on his hands, as somebody who didn't tolerate dissent, as somebody who rigged elections, as someone who was no longer a safe pair of hands. So the book took me to Uganda. I spent a lot of time there looking at, how the RPF, which came out of Uganda after all, out of the refugee camps, but also out of, a lot of people who joined the RPF and joined that secret army within the Ugandan army, where Tutsis who had lived for generations in Uganda but they came to see their future as bound up with the RPF. I heard a lot about the famous charismatic Fred Rijema, so quite a lot of my book is about him, this charismatic leader who really pulled together the RPF, a warrior to his boots, and sort of one of Museveni's most trusted fighters, who was also a Rwandan refugee and who ended up leading the RPF back into Rwanda. So the book tells the story of that invasion, of Fred's mysterious death, for which there have always been so many different theories. I still don't know the true answer, but I explore the possible explanations. And then it tracks what happens, you know, after this devastating, horrific episode that was the genocide of 1994, when the RPF then found itself running a country that had been traumatized in ways that are really hard to imagine. A huge segment of the population had been pushed across the frontiers by the Hutu extremists who didn't want the Hutu community to remain in Rwanda. And then the various adventures that followed, in which the RPF was crossing into Rwanda, how it ended up setting up, basically creating a rebel movement that toppled Mobutu Sese Seko, and going with that rebel movement, the AFDL, to hunt down the genocidaires, the extremists, and finish off what it still saw as an army in exile that threatened it. And along the way, I mean, it's been 27 years, so it's a long story. Along the way, there was a growing centralization of power in Kagame's hands, and you see these sort of various brothers, these brothers in arms who stop being quite so brotherly, and who start to become more and more unhappy and become more and more alienated, and Patrick Aragai was one of them. And the differences are policy driven, but also very personal. And I sort of, I do focus a lot on the personal stories, because it seems to me that, you know, my experience in Africa, they're what really decide things rather than the forces of history. It's the personalities that drive the forces of history. And so effectively the book is trying to explain how we got to a hotel room in Michelangelo from this sort of, this force of this band of brothers who crossed over the frontier in 1990, the frontier between Rwanda and Uganda. And one of the things that I found, I think I'm sort of probably due to wrap up quite soon, but one of the things that I found most interesting was that you had all these Tootsie exiles, former men with huge, you know, privilege and power, who, once they're in exile, find themselves pretty much on their own. And they've got friends in all sorts of powerful places, but nobody's that interested in what they have to say or what they think about the regime they left behind. And I think it became very clear to me that there was a narrative that had been constructed by these men. That's what was so ironic. They had created this narrative in which Paul Kagame was the savior of Rwanda. He came in, he ended the genocide, he rebuilt the country. There was this phoenix from the ashes story. You know, and the world, the part of this narrative was that the world, which had abandoned Rwanda during the genocide, walked away, left people to be killed by the Hutu extremists, that they were owed sort of aid, help, support, and sympathy, because they were trying to do a very difficult job. They were owed that sympathy and support by the West. It seemed to me that the development community had sort of fallen in love with this narrative, and fallen in love with the fact that Rwanda has always scored very well on all sorts of development indicators, the MDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, that it is a place that has always had a reputation for being a very easy place to do, you know, to work with the government in place, that they seem to be, you know, orientated towards all the right things: primary school education, maternal health, getting schools and hospitals built. and that the donors, the World Bank, the IMF, and all the Western countries that piled in there with this very strong sense of guilt, where we're just sort of very focused on those kind of indicators. And when embarrassing or evidence emerged which sort of undercut that story, you know, the overwhelming evidence that every election was being rigged to an inch of its life. For example, the fact that there's no independent, the few independent journalists who were trying to sort of do, you know, challenging and interesting journalism had either been killed or frightened into exile, and who were now running websites from exile. And that there was no real space in Rwanda to voice any criticisms of the government, and that, you know, political parties really all played from the same song sheet, and that was a song sheet determined by Paul Kagame and his RPF. When all those sort of worrying evidence, and the worrying evidence also of the smuggling, the wholesale smuggling of minerals from neighboring Eastern Congo, which were being smuggled into Rwanda and then re-exported as Rwandan produce, that none of that sort of awkward evidence was going to be allowed to get in the way of these development programs, because they look so very, very good on paper. So I think that was really the story I wanted to tell. It was quite a difficult story to tell, because of course a lot of people didn't want to go on the record. It wasn't something that people wanted to talk to me about. So in a lot of cases, you're having to quote people anonymously. And I think this is just my final point. One of the things I found most disappointing when I was researching this book is I completely understood that Rwandans and Ugandans who still had links with Rwanda didn't want to go on the record. But I think the thing I found really quite annoying and very disappointing was the way in which Western economists, aid officials, Western former diplomats often didn't want to go on the record either, because they weren't, it wasn't that they, you know, the other group I was talking about was scared of the Kagame regime. This group was scared of the consensus that had developed around Rwanda's development miracle. And it didn't want to be seen challenging that. And that was quite sobering, I must say.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much, Michela. Very difficult to do justice to such a big and rich book in a very short time, but thank you for that. And thank you to those people who have already written questions in the quick Q&A that we will try and pick up on later. But before we do that, and please other people do add to those, we have three panelists to respond very, very briefly. And I'm going to start, if I may, with Blessing Miles Tendi, Associate Professor of African Politics in Oxford. Miles has a particular interest in the army and politics, and is possibly a theme he'll pick up on now. But Miles, can I hand over to you?
All right, thank you for that. So 4 minutes, I'll stop at 27. Right, I want to begin by commending Michela for telling Karagere's story. Why? Because the book really offers a revealing window into the increasingly fraught power politics of Rwandan male elites. I will come back to this point about an androcentric or male-dominated politics of Rwandan elites. But before that, I want to mention 5 other themes, which I think her book facilitates important discussion about. One would be Rwanda's contentious history of political assassinations. The following one, the absence of accountability and justice for victims of political assassination, not just Karagere and his family, but also for other victims of the RPF, which Karagere once loyally served. The third would be the expansion of authoritarian governance in post-genocide Rwanda and international donors' complicity in the post-1994 undemocratic developments, points Michela touched on in the presentation. The fourth would be the complicated politics of memory, secrecy, and deceit. And the fifth, I think discussions about surveillance as cultural practice really come through in the book as well. But let me come back to my earlier point about an androcentric politics of elites. One of the reasons the RPF receives international approval is the fact that globally it has some of the highest rates of representation of women in parliament and cabinet, making Rwanda a liberal feminist success story. Yet, after reading Michela's book, the RPF's instrumentalization of liberal feminism to garner external approval and to deflect criticism of its democracy and human rights record becomes apparent. Women have high representation in parliament and cabinet, but as we see in Michela's book, the real power players are actually men. And then if you read page 428 of the book, she writes about a meeting between Kagame and the foreign minister at the time, one Rosemary Musamilani. They had a disagreement, Kagame and Rosemary. And during this disagreement, Kagame told her to remove her fat ass from his office. She delayed moving her fat ass from his office, so he physically ejected her. He threw her out, shut the door. Seconds later, the door opens again, and he throws out her handbag. What sustains that sort of violence against women? I think it's militarism. And militarism, for me, reading the book, was dripping off the pages of Michela's book. By militarism, I mean a set of deeply embedded institutions, values and ideas about violence being the ultimate resolver of tensions in politics, use of the army in a variety of external wars or interventions, emphasis on discipline and obedience in politics, the prizing of particular militaristic masculinities, and the subordination of what is deemed feminine. That comes through a lot in the book. So Rwandan militarism is partly explained by the country's history of military coups and conflict. Uganda is a neighboring country that features prominently in the book as well. Uganda as well has a history of coups and conflict that have bred militarism, as people like Jude Kagore have written about. This brings me to my final point, which is about the convoluted challenge of building authentic democracy and peace in post-war societies in which militarism is pervasive. Ex-military leaders, Kagame, Museveni, thrive best where militarism is ubiquitous. Kagame is obviously an important figure in Michela's book, but she doesn't dwell much on the person of Kagame to a high degree. Kagame is sort of a shadow that looms in the background at most times. And Michela will correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think this was intentional. I think it was very clever. Clever because with Kagame in the background, it allows the militarism to come to the fore in the book. So militarism functions without Kagame. And eventually Kagame will leave power, but militarism will remain. And militarism is likely to produce yet another ex-military leader, or if it doesn't, if it's a civilian, this he, I'm pretty certain it will be a he will embody and reproduce militarism as well, thereby extending the challenge of building authentic democracy and peace. That, to me, is perhaps the most important takeaway from Michela's book, the challenges around militarism and the ways in which it encumbers the prospects for authentic democracy and peace in post-war societies.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Miles. Thanks very much. Can I pass straight on to Susan Thompson, who's an associate professor of peace and conflict studies at Colgate University in the States, and herself the author of two books on Rwanda. Susan, can I open it to you, please?
Yes, thank you, Christopher. Good morning, everyone. I'm in the United States right now. And I wanted to speak actually to Michela's book on the strength of the relationships that drive the story, that make real the nature of elite politics in Rwanda and point to what I would call everyday forms of violence, of course, the main one of which, the systemic force, is militarism. And I've been a great admirer of Michela's work for a long time, coming to know her first and foremost as an undergraduate, reading on Eritrea. So I had very high expectations for the book because I know as an investigative journalism that she takes the craft very seriously And as a result, she structured a book that I could see critics saying is unbalanced or unfair. But what I see as someone who's studied Rwanda for a very long time is a focus on the relationships that drive the political choices of the present elite. And we begin to flesh out, I think, carefully in her carefully crafted interviews, the follow-ups, the check-ins, the relationships, the research relationships, as I consider them, of a Rwanda built for RPF and its loyalists. And I think this understanding of Rwanda as a place for those who are loyal to the RPF, whether that's a forced loyalty or a sincere loyalty, creates an interesting conundrum for analysts that Michela's book can help us understand. And that's friendships, the nature of these elite friendships. Are they instrumental friendships? Are they sincere friendships? What can these friendships tell us about the nature of elite politics in a country that has never known a peaceful transition? In a country, as Miles correctly noted, I agree with him, is beset with militarization, with a government that relies, a culture that relies on what we call doublespeak. Bert Ingelair has a great article on you say one thing, but you mean another thing. And I think that's where Michela's attention to the stories that individual told her, understanding storytelling as a method, not only reveals the systemic militarization, but also the extent to which Rwandans cannot actually discuss and dialogue in a system that is, of course, not created for discussion or for dialogue. So the fact that Karegeya fell out is obviously not surprising to those of us who watch the country. We've seen these things happen since 1994. And I think that's where the book becomes a masterclass in how to write about a country other than your own in a way that is respectful to Rwandans who survived, to Rwandans who are unable to express their experience. They have been denied the opportunity to speak about what happened to them. The book makes forays from the Rwandan perch through the character of Karegeya, the violence that he experienced and perpetrated in Uganda, also some reference to the violence that he experienced and perpetrated in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And while the book doesn't focus on Congo per se, that's not its purpose, it does trace these militarized boyhoods, young adulthoods, and eventual rise to power of very powerful individuals in Rwanda. And I think this will be my final point, Chris, don't worry. What the book does well for me is it takes contentious events such as who downed the plane, Habyarimana's plane, the event that many believe launched the genocide, is presented in multiple ways through multiple voices, leaving the reader to decide for themselves how this fact or that fact may or may not play out. Sorry, Chris, I went over.
Fine. That's fine, Susan. Thank you very much for that. Some of those themes you were talking about at the end are already being picked up in the questions as well. Can we move swiftly to our final commentator and panelist, Dr. Noel Twagiramungu, who's a research fellow at Boston University, and his full bio will be pasted in the chat function in a second. But Noel, could I please ask you now, with your rather beautiful backdrop there, to give us just a very, very concise 4-minute talk. Thank you very much.
Oh no, thanks so much. Hi everyone. I'm thankful for the Royal African Society for this opportunity to participate in the global efforts to shedding lights on the side of Rwanda, which is really also the dark side of humanity. Now, as the world joins Rwandans to mourn their dead and struggle to heal their wounds, this is a perfect moment to reflect on the reality of ongoing political murder in Rwanda. To this end, I would like just to contextualize this discussion by sharing with you a piece of wisdom from Rwanda, which states, the killer of bad guys ends up exterminating a lot of good people. This piece of wisdom has two implications with regards to the nature and extent of the disturbing reality of political murder as described in this powerful book. First, political murder is meant to serve a grand cause, the noble cause, the imperative cause, like saving lives, preserving order, saving the whole society from itself, restoring the soul of the nation. In the context of Rwanda, you can name hundreds of the so-called imperative causes in the name of which political murder has been not only justified and legitimized by the government, but also condoned or at least overlooked by the international community. The second implications related to the first one is that political murder is a trap. It is a path-dependent trap which once set up, it becomes impossible to stop. Just using the incidents of political murder mentioned in the book, I have identified over 10 categories of victims of this ongoing political murder scheme, which has been going on over the last 3 decades. So as just we all know, the very first victims of this political murder mentality were the RPF top leaders. So after the assassination after the death of Frederick Rwigema, his all close aides were also killed. So we talk about now, maybe they were killing the killers of Rwigema. That's how this political murder can be justified. The second group were the young Tootsie from Burundi, from Rwanda, from Congo, joining the RPF. Some of them were just killed because they were thought of as alleged spies from Rwanda. Then we have Hutu population in Rwanda who are just framed as obstacles to liberation. Then we have those who are killed on RPF's road to power all the way to Kigali and across the country. Then we have IDPs, we have refugees in Congo, we have infiltrators in the north of the country, or just framed as genocidaires. But then we have political disturbers, the critique, people like Seti Sendashonga. And then we have the traitors, especially those from inside, people, of course, like Karegeya. They were just killed because Kagame said we were killing the traitors. But there are two other categories which are quite even more problematic. First, they are the witnesses of those killings. People just are killed because they were witnesses, and even they are witnesses of witnesses, especially for outsiders. We think of those Canadian and
Gonna have to stop you in a sec, Noel, if that's all right.
Yeah, please.
If you could, if you want to just finish very briefly.
Yes, yeah, I was finishing, and then the last category is really the victims, potential avengers. They are people who are killed just because they are relatives, friends, or supporters of those killed. So my conclusion here is that no one is immune from the consequences and implications of the political murder trap prevailing in Rwanda today. The question is, what can the world do about it? So I thank Michela for providing us with the opportunity to start this conversation about these concerns.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Noel. Thank you. And sorry to cut you a bit short. So now we're going to open this up to the Q&A. There are already something like 18 questions there. It's going to be rather difficult to manage this in about 20 minutes. There are at least two main sort of groups I initially identified of questions, and I'm going to try and group those together into two blocks, and then we'll possibly try some further ones. So the first type of question for Michela, but mainly, but also perhaps one or more of our panelists might want very briefly to jump in too on the answers, concerns external policies towards Rwanda. So we have questions from Martin Plaut, Mark Tran, Martin Pinder, Edward Clay, and others around this theme. So Martin's asking, for example, what, Michela, you make of continued support for President Kagame by British politicians, particularly ahead of the upcoming CHOGM meeting in Kigali. Mark Tran's asking, well, look, and Edward Clay did too, well, what is it that you think governments should do? Should they cut Western aid off completely, and then Rwanda will just turn to China, which will get more influence, or is there other policy responses that you have in mind? Is there any leverage that other Commonwealth members might have? So, Michela, do you want to respond to those types of questions briefly?
Yeah, I mean, I think people always assume when that I'm being interviewed that I'm there like cut off aid to Rwanda, cut it all off now. And it seems to me that that's sort of disingenuous. It's not a very honest way of presenting the choices available. What I would like to see is a more feisty relationship. And it's interesting that you said Edward Clay had put a question, because Edward Clay is a perfect example of a feisty relationship between a key donor, the British High Commission, the British government in Kenya, when there were major issues with corruption over the Anglo leasing scam. And he found himself at odds with other donors and World Bank and IMF people who wanted, there's a sort of momentum that development programs develop all on their own, where people will fight, donors will fight to the death to just keep the program going. And they'll also be sending, watered down reflections of what's going on in their own country on either the corruption or the human rights front back to base, because they are so committed, they've become so committed to continuing their aid programs. So I feel that, before you get to an aid cutoff, there are so many steps that can be taken. There are some frank conversations in private, that should be the first step. There are some signals that the donors can send out. It wasn't a helpful signal to agree to stage CHOGM in Kigali. I mean, clearly that's going to take place now, but that was a signal of massive approval and approbation that wasn't helpful given the human rights, the deteriorating human rights record of Kigali. That shouldn't have happened. And along the way, then there are other things that can be done. One of the things that donors forget is that, for example, in any country which has local journalists, and a local, intelligentsia that's not happy with what their government is doing, they're desperate for someone to quote, airing concerns that the population feels, because they don't want to say these things themselves. So, an ambassador or a DFID official or an IMF official or a World Bank guy who dares to comment critically on a government has already done his bit for improving governance. He's given journalists something they can report on. So these are the baby steps. Later on, you can sort of make it clear that invitations will not be extended, red carpet visits will not be there. And only at the end of that process do you then need to start talking about aid cutoffs. So I think, let's accept that there are varieties of responses, and they are it's a graded response. But what I tend to see is no attempt to even start on that ladder.
Okay, thank you. I just wonder whether any of our other panelists want to add just over a minute or two on this same group of questions, this theme.
Thank you. If I can jump in, I would like just to say,
please, no.
that Michela said, they are really many ways to respond, but the best way first is to break silence. And for UK and the other really donors is to show where they stand. I think that's key. Before talking just cutting aid, but to show where they stand, as especially UK did in Geneva last time. It has an impact because people knows what they do. And this can help, of course, to not to repeat what France did in secrecy 20 years ago. I think the problem with France now, it's not really what they did, but it's how they behaved, how they did everything in secrecy, dealing with the former government. So the donor community should learn from this, how to break silence, and whenever there is a problem, to show where they stand.
Okay, thank you for that. Do either of the other two want to come in, or not for now? Okay, fine. So then the second group, and a really, really important group of questions, and I'm not sure we can do it full justice, is really around questions around bias and balance in the book. And we've got questions from a number of people: Mazimpaka, Magisha, Ben Honan, James Wizeye, there's an anonymous question or two, there's Phil Clark. But just to kind of quote from a couple of these, one of the ones that Mazimpaka Magisha puts is that you say you focus a lot on personal stories, and how can your book claim to be balanced when it's almost exclusively draws on the testimonies of those actively involved in trying to bring down the government? We have Ben Honan quoting a Financial Times journalist saying that he would have welcomed testimony of some of Kagame's Western backers. Are you not concerned that the book lacks balance as a result? James says, is your close association with RNC dissidents like Kayumba the reason why the book fails to interrogate the RNC's involvement with armed militias and terrorism in Rwanda and Eastern DRC? And I think something important to kind of put to you, Michela, is there's one anonymous attendee says, look, the book opens with a quote from a 19th century European saying, of all the liars in Africa, I believe the people of Rwanda are, oh gosh, it's gone away from me, this quote, are the most thorough. Are these stereotypes helpful to the book's narrative? Do you want to try and address some of those?
Yeah, there's lots and lots of questions. I did speak to Western backers. I quote Andrew Mitchell at some length in the book. I also reached out to other Western backers, Claire Short, Linda Chalker, and not everybody wanted to give an interview, and you can't force them to. So I sort of felt that I was much more interested in the story of the protagonists in any case than the Western reactions to the protagonists. I mean, obviously it was part of the story, but I feel I've read more about that side of things in the press, and therefore I wasn't so desperate to cover it myself. Do I give a big loudspeaker to the members of the RNC? Yes, I do, but I felt I was, there's a French phrase, corriger le tir, you know, sort of correcting a line of fire. I own 3 hagiographies of Kagame. I own endless books in which Rwanda's development and Kagame's leadership is praised to the gills. I've got endless cuttings cut from newspapers, magazines in which Kagame is praised to the skies. I think Kagame and the RPF has had a good press, and I saw this as the other side of the story, and that it was a side of the story that deserved and needed to be heard. Yes, it gives voice to people I would term to be whistleblowers, who by dint of their privileged positions and their insider status knew an awful lot of things that we hadn't necessarily read about or heard about. And I personally wanted to hear more about those stories. I think, you know, if you're a president of an African country, you've had a lot of opportunities to get your side of things across. So this was just giving the other side their due. I do talk about the RNC connections with armed militias. I don't go into it in any great depth because I don't know a huge amount of detail on it, but it's been reported on by the UN, and that UN report is in the references, and people are welcome to read that. On the stereotyping, I think that quote sadly has been taken, is from Ewan Grogan, has been taken out of context. The first person I quote in my book is the former Prime Minister of Rwanda, and then I quote another Prime Minister of Rwanda. You know, what can you say? I think my introduction tries to tease out the problems and the challenge posed by trying to tell a complicated narrative in which the people you're interviewing once used to tell you one story, one narrative, and they were often members of intelligence services. And now they are telling a different story. That's a very difficult task to carry out. I've done it to the best of my abilities, but you can never be 100% sure which version of events was true. So what I go through in the introduction is that challenge of trying to work out where the truth lies in a very complicated story in which the various key players have shifted their story with the passage of the years. And one of the cases I put is why I think the whistleblowers are quite likely to be honest at this stage of the game, because they've got nothing left to lose.
Right, thank you. I wonder if any of the others, Susan or Miles, perhaps wants to come in on this.
Chris, I wanted to say a few things. Number one, no book can please everyone. So just a reminder that what Michela says she was going to do, she did. And I think one thing that befuddles the study of Rwanda and why the book will receive such criticism and also praise is that the field is characterized by an us versus them. You're either with us or you're against us. And that inability to hold contradiction is something that I think diminishes how we might react to a book such as Do Not Disturb, but also it undermines the possibility for new questions and different ways of thinking about the Rwandan case. And you can criticize the book for being too sympathetic to the RNC. I don't think it is. And I also think criticisms that the book is too sympathetic to so-called dissenters or detractors or those who've fallen out fails to keep the spotlight where it belongs on the transgressions and indiscretions and the sheer political violence of the current Rwandan government.
Right, okay, thank you. Miles, you okay for now? All right, okay, thanks. I hope everybody can see the Q&A box, because we don't have time to do every question in detail, but you will see the strength of some of these themes and opinions coming through. But I want to kind of spread it out thematically a little bit. So to that end, maybe one or two more to add. A little bit different. One person, Scott Jones, asked two questions, but I'm going to just take the second of those, which is, are you able to draw, Michela, any comparisons with what you discovered writing this book and what you discovered, Scott says, writing about Eritrea, but I would say also your other books. And Katie Nelson asks whether you or anybody might want to discuss the breakdown in relationship between Uganda and Rwanda, Kagame and Museveni, in the context of both countries tending towards the more authoritarian in recent years. Do you want to take those two?
Oh yeah, piece of cake.
Small questions.
Yeah, no, the Eritrea analogy was very clear in my mind. I mean, it's interesting because, of course, Eritrea became very involved in Rwandan Congolese politics at the time of the AFDL rebellion, and it was backing the AFDL rebels. And you had this collection of rebel movements, guerrilla movements, who were all interconnected, all knew each other. Eritrea Ethiopia, the NRM in Uganda, the Zimbabweans, and then the Congolese movements, and the Angolans, and they all sort of had very personal relationships and very similar experiences, and many of them have experienced the same kind of trajectory. So if you look at Isaias in Eritrea, President Isaias, he too was one of a band of brothers who suffered in the trenches for decades, and they were very close, and there was this whole camaraderie, and we're all equal, and we treat each other with the respect due to warriors who are in the field, who are equals, and as Miles was saying, very, despite the fact that there were women in the EPLF, very macho society. And then when liberation is achieved in 1991, and then there's a new war with Ethiopia, the G15, the people within his own system who dare to stand up to Isaias go straight into jail and haven't been seen since. And so Isaias hasn't actually bumped off his former comrades. He's silenced them by jailing them indefinitely in perpetuity. So yeah, there are a lot of analogies, I think, between Eritrea and Rwanda. I'm afraid I'm just trying to remember what the second question was. Yes, Uganda and Rwanda. Yeah. I mean, I think, this is what you see in both countries, is a revolution going sour, and sort of it's losing its sheen. The idealism has gone, the corruption is setting in. I mean, we haven't talked about corruption, but the way in which the RPF has this hold on the economy of the country and sort of scooped up all the sort of juicy economic opportunities is a very significant factor. And I think, in Uganda, you have the historicals, the NRM, who they're not going anywhere if they can't help it. The constitution being changed in both countries long ago so that they could all they could keep running in in elections. And the same problem in both countries is, where is this headed? What's the end game? Because these are, as Miles was saying, militaristic systems, which will only, I suspect, be replaced by military system, alternative military systems. And there's a deliberate failure to groom successors, because a groomed successor is the threat. If you are a militaristic president. And the problem then is, like, what's the sustainability of this kind of way of running a country?
Right, thank you. I'm very aware that we sort of have to wrap up. I wish we didn't. There are really important questions in the Q&A box that we haven't really addressed directly. There's an interesting thread, for example, about kind of labeling, really, and about, well, look, here we are talking about state violence in politics and killing people in other countries, but what do we call people like Bush and Clinton and Blair? How do we treat a different form of, if you like, extraterrestrial political violence, which I think is a legitimate theme to raise. There are questions about how we engage with a regime which may not quite look like our ideals politically, but seems to be achieving something that many other countries are not in terms of socioeconomic development. There's Nicola Palmer's quite complex question about the cases brought against Rwandans outside of the country on allegations of involvement in international crimes, and the relationship between that, those legal processes, and extrajudicial assassinations that you talk about, and more and more and more. So there are many, many themes, but I hope that conversation will continue in some form or other. I hope people will appreciate that I hope that we've tried to capture some of the main themes addressed in the questions. And I would like to finish off by thanking the Royal Africa Society and the Centre for African Studies at SOAS for co-hosting this event. Above all, for thanking Michela for presenting the book and trying to address very important questions. And to our three panelists, to Noel, to Susan, and to Miles, and of course Nick, the director of the Royal African Society. So Nick, I don't know if you want to say a final word, but otherwise I'm just going to say thank you, everybody.
Thank you, and this debate will continue. But our thanks to Michela for being willing to come and face the fire There are a lot more questions, and I know the discussion will continue, but thanks to everybody for contributing to this and to all the attendees who asked some really important questions. So thank you all very much. The debate continues. Cheerio.
Cheerio, bye.